Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome to this session on storying loss. My name's Thom van Dooren and I'm one of the Deputy Directors of the Sydney Environment Institute at the University of Sydney. It's a pleasure to be here, and a big thank you to Zoe and others here for inviting us to be part of this event. So before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge, pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that we're on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We've got three speakers in this session. We're going to hear from each of us, because I'm also one of the speakers, before opening things up for a more general discussion and Q&A. So first off, we're going to hear from Dr. Timo Rissanen. Timo's an associate professor in fashion and textiles in the School of Design at UTS. His research focuses on design-led approaches to sustainability and social justice in fashion and textile systems. He's also a queer artist working in poetry, cross-stitch and installation. He's published 2 books on fashion and sustainability: Zero Waste Fashion Design in 2016 with Holly McQuillan, and Shaping Sustainable Fashion in 2011 with Alison Gwilt. He's founding member of the Union of Concerned Researchers in Fashion. After Timo, we're going to go onto Zoom to hear from Dr. Lucienne Rickard. So Lucienne earned her PhD in Fine Arts at the University of Tasmania and has held a Rosamund McCulloch Studio Residency at the Cité des Arts in Paris. She spent the last 10 years working primarily in drawing, with her work acquired by the Australian National Gallery, the Art Gallery of New South Wales and the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery. Her most recent work is a durational performance that we've probably all seen in one form or another, a durational performance and drawing piece titled Extinction Studies, that's been underway since September 2019. And then the third speaker is me, and I'm an environmental philosopher and writer at the Sydney Environment Institute. So I won't take up any more time with introductions and turn over to Timo.
Thanks so much, Thom. That way. I did not test this before.
It's not clicking.
Sorry, which is the end that I point?
Point that end and press that button.
Perfect. Thank you. Great. Thank you so much for having me here, and thank you everyone for being here. Because I've only have 5 minutes, I have prepared my notes and I will go through those. I will read through from my notes. Today I will briefly explore 2 ongoing crises that have intersected with my time on Earth: the loss of species that some call the 6th extinction, and the HIV/AIDS crisis. I acknowledge that I will not be able to do so with sufficient depth in the session today. I am doing that through writing. Some of it's published, some of it is forthcoming. What you see here is a cross-stitch pattern for the region honeyeater to accompany a villanelle poem that I'm writing and stitching about the species. The region honeyeater is a nomadic Australian bird on the precipice of extinction. The remaining perhaps 350 birds live in Victoria and here in New South Wales, in the Kapiti Valley and the Blue Mountains. It is one of the species Zoe and I focus on in the precarious birds. We've also done some work with Thom on the species. Zoe and I began Precarious Birds almost 5 years ago, and for the past 2 years we have made monthly trips to Taronga Zoo to spend time with the region honeyeaters there. Taronga hosts a breeding program for the birds. Honeyeaters born at the zoo are released into the wild, a wild that continues to shrink as we clear the land. Soon we will need to make a choice. Either we protect the remaining forests, or we acknowledge that it does not matter to us sufficiently whether the region honeyeater exists in this world or not. This is a concrete choice that lies in our near future. What will we choose? Extinction makes the world quieter. Last year, scientists reported that some young region honeyeater males were no longer learning their proper song because there weren't enough older males to learn it from. Instead, they are now imitating other species. This in turn can impact pairing with females, further accelerating the extinction vortex that the species is now in. Moreover, this is a loss of culture. When we make kin with the more than human, we see that any loss of culture is our loss of culture. As well as a birdwatcher, artist, and fashion scholar, I am a gay man who came out and became sexually active in 1991. There was no cure for HIV/AIDS. The prognosis was death. That fear shaped me, and its memory still does. While there still isn't a cure for AIDS, the current drugs do prolong lives and prevent transmission. Despite this, HIV/AIDS is not over. Access to drugs is a matter of privilege, of wealth, of race, and of class. People still contract the virus, and last year an estimated 650,000 people died from AIDS. The silence of the epidemic is like a chronic visceral tinnitus without a sound. Drawing connections between the looming silence of the region honeyeater and the AIDS crisis is risky. Yet one connection is clear to me: indifference. The indifference in both cases is structural. The inaction by governments through most of the 1980s delayed the development of HIV treatments at unimaginable human cost. The loss continues by the unwillingness to make drugs as accessible to all today, and indifference about certain lives. The cultural loss remains unfathomable. Clockwise from top left, here we have Peter Allen, Klaus Nomi, John Sex, Freddie Mercury, with Sylvester in the middle. They're just 5 of many voices silenced by AIDS. It is not just the possibility of music and art by countless creators that vanished. We cannot know the conversations never again had, hands never again held, love never again made. The public faces of AIDS have been predominantly white, like you see here. As Alexander Juhas and Theodore Kerr note, black and brown people continue to be disproportionately impacted by HIV/AIDS, and that is also the case here in Australia. Some lives matter less than others. Humanity has long histories of using hand stitching to process grief. Stories of loss can be made visible, physical, weighty. The Names Project, also known as the AIDS Memorial Quilt, embodies countless stories of loss, sacred cloth holding the grief. When I stitch the works in Precarious Birds, I reflect on the growing silence. As I unravel, I stitch myself back together again and again. It is not just grief I feel. There are stitches of kinship, of gratitude, even joy. Through the stitches, the cloth becomes sacred. As design academics, our tendency is to have definitive answers and to confidently propose solutions for a problem. We make strategic plans and checklists and toolkits and infographics. Standing in humility, I admit that I don't have answers or solutions. Instead, I have some questions for all of us. How do we collectively tell the stories of the extinction crisis and its associated silences? How do we make the silences visible, even physical enough to touch? I finish by inviting you in your own time to examine what indifference feels and looks like for you. I have it, you have it. What does indifference cost? What is the loss? And what are the stories we want to tell about it? Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Timo. And we're just going to hear from all our speakers, so save questions. Thank you. So next up, we'll hear from Lucienne.
Okay, great. Thank you, and thanks for inviting me to take part in this today. So I'm not sure how the slides are going to work, but should I just, oh, yep, there we go. Okay. So this is my space at the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery that I've been occupying for over 3 years now. To the left, as I'm looking at it, that large dark doorway there, that's the main entrance into the museum proper. So People can't get into the museum without walking past my space, which is pretty good. It means I get a lot of eyeballs and a lot of conversations. Perhaps if we could switch to the next slide. I've got a few, so I'll go through them quickly. So the first iteration of extinction studies, which began in September 2019, the premise of that was that I was going to be drawing recently extinct species from all over the world. And by recently extinct, the rule was that they had to have been declared extinct on the ICUN red list after the year 2000. So that's well within my lifetime. And I picked that date because I wanted it to be within the lifetimes of most people that would talk to me. And if not them, their children, or, you know, to be a tangible date, I suppose. So this little crayfish was from Mexico. Little, the drawing's enormous, but the crayfish itself was small. One of my big intentions with extinction studies is to not just focus on the cute fluffies, because nobody cares about you if you become extinct unless you're cute and fluffy. So I thought that it was about time that all the rest had a turn. It's really hard to make people feel empathy for creatures that come from wet environments. So people liked the crayfish, but people love the fluffy stuff more, unfortunately. Perhaps if we could flick to the next slide. Okay, again, not an aesthetically, traditionally beautiful species. This was the golden toad, a female golden toad. I think from Colombia, this one. So I did start the project intending to draw one species a day, because I initially thought that it was going to be really important to impress upon people the sheer number of recent extinctions. The drawing that you're looking at the moment, the toad, I think that took about 3 weeks. So I very quickly threw that rule away, because I realised that people weren't going to care that much if I was erasing these quick sketches of species. It was going to mean more if I invested more. So gradually, as we went along through the project, they took longer and longer. So if we click to the next slide. I tried to focus on plants a lot as well. It's really, really hard to get people to care about plants because they don't have a face. There were all these things that I found out through engagement with the public, because I encourage and always have done in conversations with people. I try and start as many as I can while I'm drawing. Often I don't have to try that hard. Sometimes my day will be 80% talking and 20% drawing, and you're constantly interrupted, which is good, it's fine. But you discover a lot about people. So people don't care about wet things like fish. They don't care about plants unless they have a beautiful flower. So sometimes it takes work to get people to care about these things. And that's why I tend to do a fair bit of research about each species that I'm drawing. I try and pick species that have a good narrative, I suppose. I mean, no extinct or endangered species has a good narrative, but I guess a narrative that will get people in. So, for instance, this plant was classified functionally extinct, but there were 3 that had just been discovered, and they were growing out the side of a cliff on some part of Hawaii, I think I can recall. So the fact that it was sort of this precarious existence seemed to get people in. So if you can talk to people long enough about these species, then eventually they'll care. Some people. Okay, so if we could flick to the next one, please. So I've included this slide. It's weird going through this length of time and this amount of work so quickly, but I've included this one because this was the drawing that took the longest in extinction studies. So this is a butterfly from the United States called Xerxes blue. So if I wasn't working in graphite, in grey lead, and working in colour, you would have seen these beautiful sort of luminescent blue and purple scales. So the drawing was relatively large. I think the wingtip to wingtip, it's probably over 1 metre, that drawing. And if we can flick to the next slide, you'll see why it took 3 months to draw. Okay, so I drew all the individual scales on the wing. So for 3 months, people were coming into the museum, and we do get lots of repeat visitors. So I have my regulars, just as I did when I was a waitress working in a cafe, which was what I was doing right up until extinction studies. my regulars at the museum would come back and they would see me visit after visit doing these dots for 3 months. And it generated a lot of interest in this species. And it was just, there was a campaign to save the butterfly, to purchase it, to get me to slice that bit off my piece of paper and save it. And it got a bit ridiculous. And I'd always said that this was going to be the erasing to end all erasings. It was going to be the best one because it meant the most. So as you can see, the crowd picture, that's just a fraction of the crowd. I think that we probably got close to breaking COVID rules for having a lot of people packed in that space, but there was a lot of people there. With all my erasings, I'll do a little talk about the species and say why they're special and what happened to them. And so there's an educational sort of component. I guess I'm happy to say that I've made a few people cry at that erasing, because that's the whole aim of extinction studies, to get people to feel something, because I think that that's the whole problem. We're not feeling anything or even noticing extinctions. Okay, if we could, sorry, I'm probably taking up a lot of time. We'll flick to the next one. So 3 months of work, 360 hours, and it took about 5.5 minutes to erase. So none of the erasings take that long. As you can see, you just swipe and the graphite comes off, and then you're left with the ghost image on the page, on the piece of paper, and they layer, and you end up with things that look like a bit of a fossil record, I suppose. Next one, please. And that's one of the pieces of paper that I've gone through. So to this point, I've gone through 3 pieces of paper. I'm on the 3rd one at the moment, and you can generally use a piece of paper for about a year before it's too worn out to use anymore. And it's quite nice, that effect of them layering, because at the edges you can see the species, but in the middle you lose them. You start to not be able to see what you're looking at anymore, I suppose. Next slide, please. And that was the last day of the first round of extinction studies. So you can see that, I guess the process that I go through, the pencil shavings, the dirty floor, the fingerprints everywhere, that's all part of what I'm presenting to people, I suppose. So it is this narrative about me too, I suppose, and my effort and my labour. And that's one of the most common comments I get. People will come up and I'll explain what I'm doing, and they'll say, "What a waste of time." And it is, yeah. So, but that's the point, I suppose. Waste is the point. The waste of my labour, waste of resources. I want people to think about what a waste extinction is. If we could have the next slide, please. Is there another one? Can't remember. Yep, okay. On the left is a list of the studies I drew, of the species I drew. And on the right, just another shot of the process, the pencil shavings, which I've been collecting throughout extinction studies. I've got bags and bags and bags of them now. And the next one, please. And that brings us up to extinction studies now. So I've switched from focusing on recently extinct species from all over the world, and I'm now looking at critically endangered Australian species. So I'm 3 drawings in, and at this point there is no end date for my project. So I've been told that I'll have funding for the foreseeable future, so I will just keep going for as long as I can, I suppose. So yeah. That's about it, I suppose.
Okay. We've only got about 10 minutes. We were a bit late back from coffee break. Well, I think maybe I won't talk because I don't have much to say. And instead, I might use the time to ask Timo and Lucienne a couple of questions, which was sort of my other role, and then we'll open it up. So I was, I guess, really struck by, as I have been speaking or knowing Lucienne's work and speaking to Timo, and thinking about some of the presentations we've heard already today. There's a kind of doom and gloomness to this, to both of these works. Maybe you would characterise them differently, and I certainly find strong elements of hopefulness in both of them as well. And I think actually we need to break down that distinction think thought dualistically and explore the transformative potential of grief and mourning and sitting with it and slowing down with what is being lost and holding on to it and being honest about it. And I think that's going on in interesting ways in what you're both doing. So I wondered if we might talk about that a bit explicitly. And so for you, Timo, I was wondering if you would say a bit more about that and I'm thinking actually of a conversation I had with Jamie Dunk, who's here, and some of the young people that he's working with, thinking about climate distress and youth-led responses to how to deal with that, about grief and mourning and about the importance of that as something to slow down with. And that's clearly going on in the work you're talking about. And so the AIDS quilt and the cross-stitch work that you're talking about, if you would, I'd love to hear more of your thoughts about that as a process through the artwork. And likewise, I guess in the same way, Lucienne, in your work, there's so many elements of it that connect to that, and especially the points you made about, starting with one drawing a day and then slowing down, and of course the whole practice of erasure that is behind your work and how people respond to that. But a big part of what I wonder if there's something in the way you're using the same piece of paper over and over again, and if you would say more about that. This is now just a sort of a scattergun of observations / questions, and I can't resist, of course, asking you also to maybe say a little bit about the desire to save your pictures in light of the recent sort of art gallery activism and questions over which matters more, art or the world that it represents. So maybe if we go to Timo first and then come back to you, Lucienne.
Sort of trying to get a hold of what I was going to respond. So I've been working cross-stitch for almost past 7 years now, and as most of you would know, it's a very slow method of working, and it lends itself particularly well, I think, to reflection. And I've done other works outside of Precarious Birds that have dealt with death and loss as well. And then in my scholarly work, I've also looked at other people. Like I said, there's long histories of using stitching to process grief, and there are even psychologists doing that very intentionally. There's a project, for example, called Common Threads by, being on stage, I will forget all names. It'll come to me in about 3 minutes, I'll tell you then. But there's a project by a psychologist who actually uses stitching in her workshops for participants to process grief and trauma, because the trauma is so strong they can't actually talk about what they've experienced, but they can stitch it. And so there are, and these things tend to span different cultures as well, so there is something quite, I think, deeply human and visceral about that kind of slow, concentrated practice. It doesn't have to be stitching, there's lots of other things as well. But I think it is a very effective way, and I think people also get it, like when you have a piece of cloth and that has, I did a work on suicide a few years ago, and that took me about 170 hours. And it was about the suicides of 3 men. And I do think that there is something sacred in the cloth when you think about the suicides of 3 men for 170 hours. It's not a particularly pleasant experience for the stitcher, but I do think that something is transferred to the cloth, and something is restored in the process, and that's certainly my hope with working Precarious Birds, not just for me but also for others, because I do feel the grief acutely, like the loss, all the things that we're losing on a daily basis. Like it gets overwhelming, and of course hope is important, but also we need to be careful not to sort of fall into toxic hope, a kind of toxic positivity. I do think it's important to acknowledge that the losses are happening every day, and they are our losses. They're not just, extinction is a loss for us as well. I do think that when we really start to authentically relate to ourselves as part of the rest of the living world, it becomes easier to care, about flying foxes, no matter how bad they smell in Centennial Park. I love them, and I spend a lot of time with them, by the way. But yeah, I hope that
it does. Can I ask you to make the link between the sort of the personal process of grief and mourning in cross stitch and in the meditative action, and just to throw another question onto the pile for Lucienne, and be really interested to hear about your sort of the emotional process of the hours invested there too, as an individual mourning work. But Lucienne's is a very public individual mourning work, and the AIDS quilt is a very public, and so it becomes either a political expression. It is a political expression, but it's also a public act of mourning. It's a public ritual of mourning. Is there potential also in the cross stitch for extinction, or and maybe Lucienne is sort of doing something like that, but to make it a collective project, to make it a collective act of mourning.
Absolutely. I think cross stitch may not be the best because it is so slow that you can spend 2 or 3 hours working, and I think this goes to Lucienne's butterfly as well. But in a 3-hour session, like, I basically produce a splotch of a few stitches on a piece of cloth that doesn't look like anything. It literally takes hundreds of hours for the larger images to sort of come. But then again, there are lots of, and that's, particularly in North America, but not limited to North America, there are traditions around quilt making, which is a collective activity, and the AIDS quilt very much is a collective project, ongoing collective project, and I think I would certainly say in a lot of Western cultures we're not particularly good with grief, and we're not particularly good with death, and so restoring some of the processes of grieving and honouring what we've lost, I think is really important as well.
Thank you, thanks. And over to you, Lucienne, for that long list of questions.
Okay. Yeah, I'll try and remember all the questions. I guess that a good way to start answering this stuff is that the most common question that people ask me once I've explained what I do, that I spend hours and hours drawing these species and then they're erased almost immediately. But people always ask, how does that feel? And I think that it's interesting because the erasing that I do, it's meant to make other people feel sad and to acknowledge that this species has been lost. But to me, when I erase the drawings, I find that a really, really satisfying moment, because like a pretty drawing on the wall, that's going to hold people's attention for, I don't know, what's the average? I think I learned at art school that people will look at an artwork for, on average, 3 seconds when they're visiting galleries, no matter how beautiful they find it, because we just, move on to the next. So I think that the erasing, when people witness it, even when I tell them that the drawing's erased, that they're looking at on the piece of paper, that's far more powerful than any drawing, no matter how good it is, will ever be just, well, not ever, that's a bit of a big call, but it's more powerful than just a pretty drawing there. So, and I think that it is an act of mourning. It is sad. It is confronting and pretty depressing dealing with this subject matter. But I think that I'm in agreement with Timo. It's important to acknowledge when things are sad, especially when we're culpable and we're contributing every day just in the way that we live to species loss. So people don't like having that conversation. But I think it's a really important conversation to have with people. But I guess the upside, and the reason why I'm probably not really depressed and just in a heap on the floor after doing this work for over 3 years now, the butterfly is a really good example. So I really mourned for that drawing once I'd erased it, and not because of the drawing itself. Like, I was really pleased with it, but it was a great erasing. Like, it was just what I wanted to happen. But I mourned the the loss of that drawing because for 3 months, when I draw any species, I try and really get people to notice the special thing about that species, or one of the special things that really excites me about that species. So for that one, of course, it was the scales on the butterfly's wing. And when I started drawing it, I had the body done in about a day. And then I was starting to sketch out the scales, and I was just going to do this token effort. I was drawing them way too big. And then one of the museum people that work in the education department invited me to look at a butterfly wing under a super duper microscope. And it was just mind blowing, like stunning, one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. So for that 3 months, I got a photograph, a really high res, beautiful photograph of butterfly scales close up. And I would have my iPad there and flick through images of butterfly scales to show people when I was talking about this butterfly. And that moment when you show someone butterfly scales, because they're so stunning, it's like this eye-opening event for everyone. And that was such a great thing to talk to people about. I loved it for 3 months. It was the best thing ever. So that's what I mourned, being able to talk about how incredible that species was. So that's how it's positive as well, I suppose. Is that an answer?
It definitely is, yeah. No, I think that's wonderful. I think it's something that's definitely in my work also, and in Timo's, is that it's also an act of celebration alongside mourning, and yeah. But I don't think it appeals or convinces everyone that this is a good way to approach these things and to hold on to mourning in that way. But I'm convinced. So yeah, thank you. Do we have time for? We're out of time, aren't we? Okay, we have time for a question.
Sorry, it was part of your original round of questions, but I would really love to hear the reason behind the one piece of paper and just having those drawings kind of overlap, but trying to hold on to that piece as long as possible.
Did you hear that, Lucienne? Probably not.
Nope.
No. It was one of my original scattergun of questions about why the one piece of paper over and over again.
Right. So when I first approached the people that funded me to do this project with an idea, I was so furious about the state of the environment in Australia that my original idea was to go and sit on Parliament lawns and do drawings and then burn them when they were done, which after a really quick discussion, we decided that wasn't a great idea. I was probably going to get arrested pretty quickly, and it was carbon emissions and not safe and all that kind of stuff. So there was a real anger at the heart of the idea to destroy the drawings. But in a sort of discussion with my funders, we came up with the idea of erasing. So I can't take complete credit for that. It was definitely a collaborative approach. But yeah, one big piece of paper, we were just going to erase them. And I didn't think there was going to be as much of a ghost image left as there has proven to be every time. So the first erasure, I just thought, oh God, it's a disaster. But eventually that turned into a really good thing. So it became about people being able to see the erasures, but also just not being a big hypocrite and going through reams and reams and reams of paper when you're doing a project about the environment too. So yeah, but I love the way the paper wears. There's all these beautiful aesthetic sort of things that have sprung up from the process that I didn't realise were going to happen too. So there was a lot of luck involved.
Yeah, that's great. I had wondered if once you see all those ghost animals and plants in the background, it almost looks like an ecology that's sort of being layered over. And yeah, I had taken it as a kind of disruption of the singular animal or plant on its own on a blank piece of paper, that actually it's a part of an ecology or community. Obviously that isn't the actual ecology or community because they're creatures from all over the world, but it helps to disrupt that singular species on a blank page. So aesthetically I've found it beautiful also. I think we're out of time. We are, yes. I'm sorry we're out of time. Thank you so much for joining us, Lucienne, and thank you, Timo.